Hello and welcome as we come now to the fourth Sunday of the year. And the readings this time, the first reading comes from the prophet Zephaniah, chapter 2, verse 3, and chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. The second reading comes from, again, Paul's letter to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 26 through 31. And the gospel comes from Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12a. So this year, as we have noticed, is called the A year and is the year of Matthew. And for now, as we go for the next couple of weeks, there will be a continuity of readings from Matthew. I thought we could begin by simply reviewing a little bit the Matthean tradition. We are aware that the Gospel was written sometime in the 80s, most likely in the year 85, that this Gospel writer is well aware of the tradition of Mark, often uses his structure and his chronology to tell the story of Jesus, but he, along with Luke, also has information that comes from what is known as the Q source, a collection of sayings of Jesus that apparently were available for consultation by writers such as Matthew, and that Matthew also has his own special sources which belong only to him and which do not belong to the other synoptics or to the other gospel writers. You will remember that the two opening chapters of Luke's, Mark's, Matthew's story deal with the conception and infancy of Jesus. We have looked at them particularly during the Christmas season, which we looked at a few weeks ago. So this time, we're going to pick up the story of Jesus, as Matthew remembers, with the beginning of his teaching. But we need to back up just a little bit, because chapter 5 and the first two chapters, 1 and 2, leave us with the fact that there are two chapters in between, chapters 3 and 4. And just to kind of review that and bring it up to where the Matthean story goes, that Matthew has given us a background and message with regard to John the Baptist. We have seen that in the course of his teaching, Jesus had come and that John had baptized Jesus. In that story, you will remember that Jesus had asked for baptism by John. John had said, well, wait a minute, it should be the other way around. But you remember that Jesus had encouraged it because he said, this is what is expected right now. Now, that would be material found in chapter 3. Chapter 4 begins with the testing of Jesus. Now, we're not going to look at that presently. The first Sunday or weekend of Lent will use those verses 1 through 11 in chapter 4. Then in the rest of that chapter, Jesus, you remember, had gone to the city of Capernaum, what we heard last time, chooses for men to be his disciples, namely Peter and Andrew, James and John. And that, after the call of those 4 disciples, now brings us to the episode that we're going to look at this time. But it's important to notice how the development of his narration, of his reflection on the meaning of Jesus, his teaching, and who he is takes place by Matthew. Now, as chapter 5 begins, and this is what we will be looking at, it is an introduction to what is known as the Great Sermon. Now, in Matthew's story, he presents Jesus as giving 5 major speeches. They would be found in chapter 5 through 7, chapter 10, chapter 13, chapter 18, and chapters 24 through 25. So 5 teachings. Keep in mind, and I think we have mentioned this before, that the model that the Matthean writer uses is that of Moses and particularly the Torah, which would be, from one point of understanding, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, or the First Testament, known also as the Pentateuch, and we have noticed this on other occasions, include the book of Genesis, the book of Exodus, the book of Leviticus, the book of, and finally the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. Now, they are always sometimes referred to as the books of Moses, but we now know, of course, that Moses didn't write these books, but that the fundamental person standing behind the message in those books, not as easy to see in the first book, but in the next 4 lies Moses. Moses is the major hero, teacher, healer, anything that you can say about an important person, you can say about Moses. And therefore, for the Matthean writer, Moses is the model. And what since there are 5, if you kind of make this connection, 5 speeches that Jesus gives, there are 5 books in the Pentateuch or in the Torah, so you can kind of see, again, Matthew is very sensitive to the use of the symbolisms, often of numbers, and how they play an understanding of the message that is recorded in the first set of scriptures in the Hebrew Bible. The Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7, is the longest of the talks that Jesus gives. Now, there is a certain pattern that is followed in this, and I'm kind of putting some of these little pieces together, that Jesus here, as chapter 5 begins, goes up a mountain. Now, please don't think of a huge mountain, but he goes up a mound. Does this sound familiar if you're listening to the words of the Old Testament? Yes, because it was when Moses went up on the mountain that God spoke to him and that God gave him the commandments. And thus, mountains, as we have noticed on other occasions, generally indicates that God in some way is going to be present or that God speaks. So, it's called the Sermon on the Mount, all right? Now please, as I say, just think that it's high enough for Jesus to sit. Now, some have noticed that there's a kind of little triad arrangement of this, and always keep in mind that Matthew is writing a literary work. Yes, and also a theological work, but not necessarily terribly accurate, nor concerned with history or with geography in some ways, I suppose, is used symbolically. But keeping all of that there's a great complexity and artistry that the writer here uses in presenting this story about Jesus. All right, now, if you kind of look at this, you find Jesus seated on the mount. Then immediately around him are the disciples. Now, how many disciples are there who are gathered there? We have only heard so far, that's why I reviewed this, the story of 4 of them. Were there others? Did some time pass between the beginning of this teaching and Jesus' mission? Some would say that the apostles or disciples represent the church, and so that they are the earliest founders of believers in Jesus and his message, and so that they are immediately the ones who receive this teaching of Jesus. And then there is another circle of listeners who are the masses, the ordinary people. And as we have noticed also, and will continue to notice in Matthew's story, this includes not only Jews but also Gentiles. And so others would say that now you have gathered around Jesus as he is about to give this great sermon, the world. So that's another interpretation. You have Jesus, you have the church, and then you have the world. And all of them are pictured as kind of, listening or seated around as Jesus gives his talk here, this famous Sermon on the Mount. Now, as we have mentioned, mountains also represent a place of revelation. And so Jesus is going to be revealing information. And there is a certain sense in which the gospel message of Matthew is what we would call eschatological, looking for a time to come. Although certainly those listening and hearing this gospel, although they certainly were looking forward to a coming in splendor and glory of Jesus, also recognized that the message they were receiving was for the present. All right, so again, as we have noted also, and just as kind of bringing some of this to a forefront, we have noticed that importantly throughout the Mediterranean world was and is the value of honor. This is the central value that brings people together, that develops a behavior, and that always honor is a public claim to worth, a public acknowledgement by others of the claim that Jesus is, and this, although this we have not kind of seen this, but after his baptism, remember, the Son of God. That indeed, that is a great honor that God is bestowing upon Jesus, and thus this whole question of honor keeps kind of emerging throughout the gospel tradition. Moses, of course, was truly honorable, as you are, O Israel, who is like you, the people saved by the Lord. So the honor that God brings to Israel through Moses is the greatest of honors. So always try to keep in mind that idea of honor as we listen to Matthew through the coming, at least up until the beginning of Lent, we will be listening to this. Now, that namely, the Sermon on the Mount, which has a number of individual pieces, and we begin, and so let's go there. We begin this time with what are known as the Beatitudes, or blessed are they, or happy are they, or delighted are they. There are different ways in which translators have taken that word and how it is understood or how it is used. We do believe that these Beatitudes, so I'll just call them that, were originally to be found in the gospel tradition of Luke. And he develops his thought around three Beatitudes, or three sayings that are important. And thus we find that Matthew creatively expands the 3 to 8. So that's a contribution that is unique to the Matthean tradition. As we have noticed on other occasions, and when you look at Luke's story, we'll see that he presents ultimately not only 3 but 4 and matches them, very different style than Matthew has here. The 3 that are most important, and whether one looks at Luke or whether one looks at Matthew, the 3 that are most important are those that deal with the poor, with mourning, and with the hunger. So they are the kind of key concepts or key ideas that lie in the Beatitudes. The poor, we have noticed this on other occasions, is a rather large group of people. The poor certainly can be, and sometimes were, those who physically were poor. They simply did not perhaps know when the next meal was coming from, or had to scratch out a living on a daily basis, and kind of just made it through the day for existence. So the poor certainly could fall, and do fall, into that category. But as we have also noticed, the poor is a biblical word which includes a lot of other persons. It generally includes persons who do not have legal rights or do not have an opportunity to speak to those who are in power or in authority. So the poor, well, that would be, as we've noticed, and we will continue to bring this to our attention as we go along, those whom we would call the disabled, or the handicapped, or whatever the term today is for using them, but they were considered the poor. And thus, for example, we find Jesus healing the blind, the lame, etc. So you get what I mean, that when we say that they were limited in a certain way in the use of certain abilities that belong to us as humans. So that would be one group who were considered to be the poor. Obviously, those who have no rights would have been slaves. They were considered to be the poor. And we have mentioned that slavery, not as it existed in the American scene, but certainly in the first century world, included a large number of people. So they were those who, and I mentioned that the slave status would have been, in their own way, temporarily lost their position, because a slave could, over a period of time, if they were slaves because they owed a debt or because of some other situation, once it was paid, then would be restored to the rights that belong to people. So that it was, in that way, an honorable status that could be restored because of somehow it had got lost. So how would you lose it? Well, you owed somebody money, so you became a slave for them and worked for them or with them until such time as the money you had got from them was repaid back. So you see what I mean? All costs to regain status of honorable could take place. Also, as we have noticed, belonging to this category of the revolving would be widows and orphans. They were often considered the poor, but a widow, if she remarried and then became part of an extended family, was no longer considered in the poor. Or if an orphan who lost his status but was brought into a family and kind of joined in there, regained his honor. Therefore, he would no longer belong to the poor. But also, just generally, by the way, women belong to the concept of the poor because they had no public voice in society. Although, and studiers of the first century Mediterranean world do notice that there were some women who did have a voice in how things were run. These would be well-to-do women, sometimes widows, but nevertheless, I hate to say this, but if you have money, sometimes you can kind of influence the way things happen or who makes things happen. So first century world was sometimes as complex as is the 21st century world that we are. I think it's complex when one looks at kind of things. So as Matthew begins, he has now 8 sayings of Jesus. Let's look a little bit at those. They have been subject to considerable interpretation, okay? So keep in mind here that we're just going to offer a few insights how to appreciate the teachings that are recorded here as Jesus giving. You might find other scripture scholars or interpreters taking the phrases that Jesus uses and giving them another sense of meaning as they go along. Not that they're not right, but then again, what we try to give here is an original sense of how those words would have been understood. So blessed are the poor in spirit. Luke had called it, blessed are the poor. Now, poor in spirit here really means about the same thing. Just in passing, the Spirit of God, the Spirit of life, blessed are the poor in spirit. So, as we have noticed, a beggar could be poor in spirit. In fact, some say that the word spirit here is better understood as beggar. I don't know. Interesting, isn't it? Blessed are the beggars. Well, when people come to your table asking for food or something, maybe. All right. Anyway, this whole first beatitude speaks of the need for special care for the poor. Blessed are the poor, whoever they are. Blessed are those who mourn. The background here comes from Isaiah chapter 61, verses 2 and 3, where the prophet's mission, that is, Isaiah the prophet, and keep in mind, and this again is a point we're noticing as we go along, how very, very indebted to Old Testament figures and sayings is the gospel writer Matthew. He very much uses Old Testament, we say, sayings, because his understanding is that Jesus, who comes as the messenger of the Father, does not come to change the law, that is the Torah, but to bring it to fulfillment. And that's a term that will be used very often, how Jesus brings things to a deeper level, to a richer understanding of things. So those who mourn, what was the prophet's mission? Involved, this would be Isaiah. Notice where it comes from, chapter 61. We've talked about Isaiah on a number of times. This is the section where the prophet's mission involves comforting all those who mourn the loss of Zion, who mourn the loss of Jerusalem. See, so the historical setting had to do with a very real experience that the prophet Isaiah was living through. This, by the way, would have been second Isaiah, okay? Remember we said there were three, first, second. The Isaiah who lived during the time of Israel's exile. So mourners would be that. The meek comes from a reference to Psalm 37, verse 11. The meek shall possess the land. This is sometimes the same term as for the poor, but it is not just for the land, but for the whole world. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, this comes from Psalm 107, verses 5 and verses 8 through 9. I give this so that you can see the connection that Luke makes with the Hebrew Bible. God is satisfying the hungry and the thirsty. Righteousness refers to God's justice, and then to human relationships and behavior. Merciful, this comes from Proverbs chapter 14, verse 21, who says that mercy is a reward for kindness to the poor. Mercy is an attribute of God. God is merciful, but who now shares that mercy with humans and asks them to share it with others. Blessed are the poor in heart. Well, this is from Psalm 24, verses 3 and 4. And here it is a reward for kindness to the poor. Mercy, the pure in heart, does not refer to sexual ritual purity, okay? It has nothing to do with that, nor to a single-heartedness. Rather, pure in heart is a characteristic of people of integrity, whose moral uprightness extends to their inmost being, and whose actions and intentions correspond. So there's a lot going on in that pure in heart idea that we can just kind of allude to a little bit here this time. Blessed are the peacemakers. Peacemaker here refers to the Hebrew word shalom, which certainly we have heard many times. Peacemaker is someone who is in active pursuit of peace. Peacemakers, it says in the saying that we hear, will be invited to join the angels. So all of this up to this point has been phrased in the third person singular. Now Matthew goes to the second person. And blessed are you who, when you endure persecution for the sake of righteousness, will receive reward. So that's a kind of brief and quick little look at the 8 sayings of Jesus that are offered here. Being poor, therefore, constitutes true honor. And it goes back to a point we made as we begin today, how important honor is in the tradition. We will have more reference of this as time goes on. Just a quick conclusion, the prophet Zephaniah, who operated during the time of King Josiah, one of the reformer kings. This was in 640 through 609, before the Common Era. Judea at this point was a vassal to Assyria. Assyria will be destroyed. Egypt wants to take over for Assyria. That will not happen. God it is who will destroy Assyria. And as we will hear, Zephaniah speaks of humility, of those who observe God's law, of those who seek justice and humility. So such can do no wrong, and therefore they do not engage in lying and deceit. However, in the first century world, that was okay. Anyway, that's just a quick survey of Zephaniah and why it is chosen, because of the ideas of the God's law, the new Torah that Jesus fulfills. Well, thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.